The first sensation was the cold dread of realizing the limits of her body were not her own. Alara tried to scream, but the effort yielded only a pressurized whistle trapped in her throat. She was awake. That much was terrifyingly clear. She could hear the rhythmic drip-drip of the IV, smell the sharp, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol mixed with stale air, and see the low, humming fluorescent lights of the ICU above her. But when she commanded her fingers to curl, they remained perfectly straight. When she tried to turn her head toward the door, her neck held fast. She was entombed in her own consciousness. The truth hit her not as a gradual suspicion, but as a sickening, immediate certainty. Serafina had done this. Her elder sister, her lifelong confidant, the one she protected with a blind, desperate loyalty, that loyalty, her fatal naivete, had been the key Serafina used to lock the cage. For years, Alara had dismissed the slight tremors of resentment in Serafina's voice whenever their father spoke of the Blackwood estate inheritance, rationalizing it as sisterly competitive spirit, never true malice. Now staring at the ceiling of this hospital in coastal Maine, Alara understood. Malice was all that was left. She remembered the celebratory glass of sherry the night the will was read, Serafina's favorite, dark and sweet. And then, the crushing fatigue, the sudden inability to swallow, the emergency rush to the hospital, masked by Serafina's tearful performance about a sudden neurological collapse. Alara realized Serafina hadn't aimed for a quick death. She aimed for control, a state of permanent incapacitation that rendered the will, which gave Alara the controlling interest in the family trust, irrelevant. Alara had to find a way to communicate to break free from this paralyzing spell before the final probate hearing. She heard a doctor mention the date, Thursday morning. That gave her 72 hours, exactly. If she failed, Serafina would sign the papers, pulling the plug or transferring Alara to a permanent, unmonitored facility, and claim everything. She had always been willing to believe Serafina's lies, but staring at the ceiling, she finally understood the cost of that faith. The sterile environment of the New England hospital was a fortress designed for healing, yet for Alara, it felt like the most dangerous place on earth. The nurses changed shifts, their soft-soled shoes squeaking down the linoleum corridor, the routine sounds of life utterly meaningless to her internal panic. Her paralyzed state, medically diagnosed as Guillain-Barré syndrome or an atypical stroke, a diagnosis Serafina had carefully encouraged with false history and selective reporting, was her cage. But her mind, sharp and raging, was the key. She needed to signal. Anything. The only part of her that seemed to retain sporadic, minute control was the very corner of her right eye, the muscle so fine and small that even the attending physician, Dr. Chen, missed the subtle tremor. When Serafina visited that evening, dressed in a muted gray silk suit and smelling faintly of expensive jasmine perfume, Alara fixed her gaze. Serafina sat beside the bed, took Alara's hand, cold and unresponsive, and offered a practiced, mournful sigh. "Oh, Alara, I wish you hadn't been so careless with your health. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. The estate, the foundation, just rest, darling." The words, dripping with false comfort, were a dagger. Alara strained, focusing every ounce of her will into that single eyelid muscle. Flicker. Serafina, too absorbed in her performance, didn't notice. But the sound of the metal watch band clinking against the plastic bedrail as Serafina leaned closer made Alara's skin crawl with the phantom itch of powerless fury. The clock was ticking. Only a mere 68 hours remained until the Thursday morning hearing. Alara knew her fatal naivete was still partially in control. She desperately wanted to believe Serafina couldn't be this monstrous, even as the evidence lay in her leaden limbs. This small internal conflict was exhausting her, stealing precious energy she needed to fight. She had to focus on the external world, the texture of the crisp, starched cotton sheets beneath her cheek. Her first target was Nurse Patricia, a kind-faced woman whose movements were predictable and whose focus was often split between the monitors and her notes. Alara needed to practice the flicker, turning the unconscious twitch into a deliberate signal. The silence of her own body was the loudest accusation she had ever heard, a constant reminder of the trust she had misplaced. The challenge was immense, turning a near-invisible twitch into a communicative gesture, all while under the constant, vigilant scrutiny of the hospital staff, and worse, the occasional saccharine visits from Serafina. Alara spent the long hours of Tuesday night, the air conditioning unit producing a steady metallic hum, attempting to gain control of her orbital muscles. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the paralysis pressing down on her chest, making every breath a shallow struggle. The texture of the plastic tubing leading into her arm felt cold and rigid, a permanent attachment. Obstacle 1. The practical test. Nurse Patricia entered at 6 a.m., bringing with her the faint, comforting smell of strong coffee. Patricia checked the vitals, humming a low tune. This was Alara's opportunity. Patricia leaned close to adjust the pillows, murmuring about the chilly weather typical of the Maine coast in autumn. Alara focused on the small silver cross necklace Patricia wore. If she could make 3 distinct, rapid flickers, it might be interpreted as abnormal. She strained. 1 flicker. It felt like moving a mountain. 2 flickers. Her head pounded from the exertion. Patricia paused, her brow slightly furrowed as she looked at Alara's face, which, according to the medical charts, should be completely mask-like. Then, the 3rd. 3 blinks. Patricia hesitated for a second, then glanced at the monitor, dismissing it as a spasm. "Just relax, dear," she whispered, smoothing the sheet. She recorded the vitals and moved on. The attempt failed. Alara's internal despair was a hot coal in her chest. She had failed the first, simplest challenge of competency. She needed a more aggressive strategy, a signal too clear to ignore. And the time was shrinking. 60 hours. Until Thursday. The inability to move was a physical cage, but the realization that her small act of defiance was invisible was a cruelty reserved only for the silent. The morning passed in a frustrating blur of clinical indifference. Dr. Iowa Chen conducted the rounds, commenting on the remarkable stability of the patient's vitals, despite the severity of the alleged condition, a detail that made Alara's internal alarm bells ring louder. The chemical smell of cleaning fluid lingered after the janitor passed, momentarily masking the pervasive scent of antiseptic. Alara needed to force a reaction, something physiological that required intervention, maybe a change in her heart rate or breathing pattern, but her nervous system refused to cooperate. Serafina returned that afternoon, bringing not jasmine this time, but the sweet, sickly smell of lilies, which she placed on the bedside table. Serafina leaned close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, icy whisper. "The lawyers are reviewing the transfer papers, Alara. By Friday, you'll be moved to a private facility upstate, where they specialize in long-term vegetative care. Much quieter, better view. Think of it as a vacation." She smoothed Alara's hair, the texture of her touch predatory and cold. Alara knew the upstate facility was Serafina's final trap, unmonitored, distant, ensuring no chance of recovery or communication. This visit intensified Alara's resolve. Her eyes tracked the rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor display, a green line dancing across the screen. If she could somehow manipulate the tiny, involuntary movements she sometimes felt in her neck, perhaps she could distort the reading, signaling distress. She began an exhausting internal battle. She focused on the barely perceptible, deep-seated ache in her left shoulder, imagining it contracting. Sweat broke out on her brow, despite the cool air. The low, steady beep, beep, beep of the monitor remained maddeningly regular. Her body was a foreign country she couldn't govern. Her failure to signal wasn't just physical impotence, it was the direct consequence of her initial fatal naivety, which had allowed Serafina the time and access to administer the paralysis agent undetected. The seconds bled into minutes. Only 52 hours remained. The next morning brought Dr. Chen again, this time accompanied by a younger resident, Dr. Ramirez. Alara sensed a subtle change in their interaction. Dr. Chen seemed tired, but Ramirez's eyes held a genuine, analytical curiosity. This was Alara's second, more complex challenge, the moral dilemma. She had to risk her own physical stability to gain attention, knowing any dramatic event would be immediately blamed on her deteriorating condition, which Serafina would use to justify immediate removal from the hospital. Dr. Chen began testing reflexes. When the doctor tapped Alara's knee, a familiar, distant sound of hospital chatter echoed from the hallway. Alara used every ounce of internal strength, focusing on the peripheral connection she felt in her diaphragm, trying to force an involuntary cough or gasp. Nothing. Dr. Ramirez picked up the chart, his thumb tracing the notes on the alleged cause. Then, Serafina walked in, carrying a thermos. She smelled strongly of peppermint, probably covering the scent of the nerve agent, Alara thought with a sickening jolt. Serafina offered Dr. Chen the thermos, claiming it was Alara's favorite herbal tea. "She always loved this, doctor. Maybe the scent will bring her some comfort." This simple, caring act was the perfect cover for a slow, consistent dose of the paralyzing agent, which Alara suspected was metabolized slowly by the body. Obstacle 2. The sacrifice. Alara realized she couldn't simply signal. She had to reject Serafina's care. As Serafina approached with the cup, Alara fixed her gaze on the thermos, remembering the texture of its worn metal exterior. She focused the entirety of her will on her tear ducts. She couldn't move her face, but a single hot tear tracking a path down her temple was something the doctors couldn't ignore. She strained, pushing until the pressure behind her eyes was unbearable. A tear slipped free. Dr. Ramirez saw it first. Dr. Chen, look. A tear. Dr. Chen frowned, dismissive. It's a neurological overflow resident. Common in these cases. Reversome 1. But as Serafina moved the cup closer to Alara's lips, Alara's eye, the one she had practiced with, locked onto Serafina's. She flickered it rapidly, once, twice, 3 times, then immediately focused on the ceiling, mimicking a neurological seizure. Serafina, momentarily exposed, stumbled backward, dropping the thermos. It didn't break, but the clatter and the liquid spilling on the polished floor caused chaos. Dr. Ramirez, seeing the combination of the tear and the sudden reaction against the sister, began to question the diagnosis. Alara had just rejected her caretaker and alerted one doctor, but she was now in severe medical distress. The belief that her paralysis was a simple illness was shattered for Ramirez. The single tear was the cost of the sacrifice, a profound violation of her own forced stillness, but it was the only proof she had left. Time was now critical. 40 hours. Remaining. The spilled peppermint tea, now staining the floor of the room in this quiet hospital in the northeastern United States, became the physical manifestation of the disruption. Serafina recovered instantly, adopting the persona of the distraught sister. Oh, my poor Alara. She must be distressed. Doctor, please, anything to calm her. Her voice was high-pitched, laced with barely contained panic. Dr. Chen remained skeptical, focusing only on stabilizing Alara's vitals, which had spiked during the episode. But Dr. Ramirez ignored Chen, his gaze moving between the paralyzed woman and her seemingly anguished sister. He approached the spilled liquid, noticing the faint, sharp smell of the herbal blend, but also something metallic underneath. He took a sample with a sterile swab, slipping it into his pocket without drawing attention. Alara knew the gamble was risky. Serafina now understood that Alara was conscious and trying to communicate. The stakes had been raised. Serafina leaned in again, ostensibly to wipe Alara's forehead with a cool cloth, but her whispered message was chilling. You think a little eye twitch will stop the legal system? You were always so dramatic, Alara. But now you're just pathetic. The texture of the damp cloth against Alara's skin felt like coarse sandpaper. The confrontation had bought Alara an ally, but it had also accelerated Serafina's timetable. Later that evening, the nurses spoke quietly about a consultation being scheduled for the next morning, a decision about permanent respiratory support. Serafina was pushing for the final lethal move. The air was thick with the silent threat, and Alara knew that every second counted. Every breath now felt borrowed. 30 hours remained. The urgency was a tightening wire around her skull. Dr. Ramirez returned late, around midnight, avoiding the head nurse. He was carrying a small notebook, and his presence felt like a fragile shield against the night. The only illumination came from the monitor, casting a sickly green glow. He leaned close, his voice a barely audible hum against the sound of the ventilator. I had the tea analyzed. No known toxins, but there was a strange, organic compound. I'm running secondary tests. He paused, looking directly into Alara's eyes. If you can hear me, I need a confirmation. 1 blink for yes, 2 for no. But only when the door is closed, and only once. Alara's heart pounded, rattling the silence of the room. This was the moment of empowerment, the first real communication. She focused all her remaining fragile control on that one muscle. The effort was agonizing, making the plastic oxygen tube feel like fire against her nostrils. 1 slow, deliberate blink. Yes. Ramirez inhaled sharply. His hands, gripping the notebook, were shaking slightly. Okay, Alara. We don't have much time. I suspect it's a specific paralytic, one that mimics natural illness, possibly administered incrementally. He glanced at the chart. Your sister pushed for the transfer approval tomorrow morning. The full review is scheduled for 8 a.m. Alara's mind raced. She had to communicate the most crucial piece of information, the frequency of the dosing. She couldn't use the blinking code without attracting suspicion. She needed to signal the timing. The realization that a young doctor, trusting instinct over experience, might be her only salvation gave Alara a terrifying spike of hope. She felt the rough texture of the oxygen mask pressing against her face. She had to use her next chance wisely. 24 hours. Until the transfer. The final confrontation was looming. Serafina arrived early before the morning rounds, smelling of rain and expensive leather. She bypassed the nurse's station, using her familiar access code, a quiet, almost inaudible click, as the door opened. She wasn't carrying tea this time. She carried a single pre-filled syringe. Obstacle 3. The crisis. Serafina stood over Alara, her face devoid of the previous pretense of grief. You made a scene, Alara. That little tear. It was stupid. I have to finish this now. It's better this way, believe me. You won't feel a thing. The silver gleam of the needle, reflected in the harsh morning light of the main facility, was blinding. This was the moment where Alara's fatal naivete truly caused the maximal loss. Her trust had led directly to this final, near-fatal moment. Just as Serafina reached for the IV port, Dr. Ramirez's hurried footsteps sounded down the hallway. Serafina froze, hiding the syringe in the fold of her jacket. Ramirez burst in, his chest heaving, holding a printed lab report. Dr. Chen. Wait, the secondary analysis confirmed it. Tetrodotoxin derivative, a paralytic that is nearly impossible to trace, disguised in the tea's alkaloids. Slow, systematic poisoning. It perfectly mimics the onset of Guillain-Barré. Serafina, trapped, chose aggression. She lunged, not at Alara, but at Ramirez, grabbing his arm. The loud metallic clatter of the dropped lab report hitting the ground was the only sound. Alara knew this was her last chance. The physical struggle between Serafina and the doctor provided the necessary cover. Her entire body, fueled by pure adrenaline, strained against the paralysis. She didn't manage a blink. She managed a single agonizing movement of her left hand. A finger twitched violently, enough to pull the IV line from her arm, causing a sudden warm gush of blood against the cool, dry skin. The alarm shrieked. Beep, beep, beep. Alara was finally free of the line of poison, but the resulting blood loss and medical panic could easily mask Serafina's actions, leading the doctors to focus on stabilizing the patient, not arresting the sister. The clock read 7:55 a.m. 5 minutes until the decision. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses rushed in, Dr. Chen following, demanding explanations. The sight of Alara's arm, bleeding and disconnected from the life-sustaining fluids, caused the focus to shift entirely to the patient. Serafina used the diversion, attempting to snatch the dropped lab report. She was breathing heavily, her jasmine perfume now mixed with the bitter scent of panic. Ramirez, recovering quickly from the shove, tackled Serafina, not physically but legally, pointing at the syringe falling from her jacket pocket. That is the murder weapon, doctor. The patient's sister just assaulted me and tried to tamper with evidence. The syringe, small and sinister, rolled near Alara's bedside table, catching the light. Dr. Chen, a man of rigid adherence to procedure, hesitated, torn between the immediate medical crisis, the alarming sound of the monitor, and the unthinkable accusation. Alara lay amidst the disarray, her lungs working overtime to sustain a breath, the paralyzing grip starting to loosen infinitesimally due to the missed scheduled dose. She saw the uncertainty in Dr. Chen's eyes. He needed indisputable, irrefutable proof that Serafina was not the grieving sister, but the perpetrator. The deepest, darkest hour of Alara's soul arrived, marked by the smell of her own blood and the texture of the cool metal bedrail under her cheek. She had trusted her sister blindly, allowing the snake into the sanctuary of her life, and that trust had cost her everything: her voice, her mobility, and nearly her life. The pain of the physical struggle was nothing compared to the agony of that betrayed love. She had to shed the last vestiges of her fatal naivete, accepting that the gentle, protective mask Serafina wore was merely a shell for pure greed. She needed one final, undeniable gesture. The air thrummed with tension, the rhythmic thump-thump of Alara's heart monitor accelerating. Serafina, realizing her entire plot was collapsing in this small room in the United States, made a desperate lunge for the door. Dr. Chen, finally connecting the lab report, the syringe, and Ramirez's frantic claims, moved to intercept her. This was the climax. Alara, having accepted the definitive loss of her sister, the permanent shattering of that family bond, found an incredible primal strength. The paralyzing agent was still working, but the tiny reserve of muscle control she had been cultivating erupted. She focused on her face, the place where all emotion was usually visible. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move her jaw. But she could control the muscle around her eye, the same one that wept the solitary tear. As Serafina was being physically restrained, yelling denials, Alara looked at Dr. Chen, then at Serafina. She then made the movement she had practiced endlessly, 3 rapid flickers. Then, she fixed her gaze on the syringe lying near the floor. Serafina, seeing the undeniable accusation in her sister's eyes, a clarity that defied the medical diagnosis, screamed, "She's lying! It's the illness talking!" But the flicker was too intentional, too focused. Dr. Chen, a man of science, looked at the lab report again, then at the syringe, then back at Alara's communicating eye. The pattern was undeniable. He signaled the nearest nurse to call hospital security and the police department for a possible attempted murder. The loud, decisive click of the metal cuff closing around Serafina's wrist was the loudest sound Alara had ever heard. The paralysis was her prison, but now it was also her witness, silently screaming the truth the doctors had ignored. The clock on the wall showed 8:01 a.m. They had missed the legal deadline, but the medical crisis had been averted. The police secured Serafina and the evidence. The ensuing hours were a blur of bewildered doctors, hurried interviews, and the quiet, determined efficiency of Dr. Ramirez, who immediately started Alara on a high-dose neutralizing protocol for the specific toxin. Dr. Chen, humbled and shocked, stood by the window, his back to the room, wrestling with the ethical failure of missing the signs. The smell of sterile swabs and residual pepper spray from the security incident hung heavily in the air. Weeks passed. The paralysis gradually receded, nerve by nerve, fiber by fiber, an agonizingly slow emergence from the tomb. Alara eventually regained enough mobility to sit up, to manage a weak, raspy whisper, and finally, to move her hands. She was a medical anomaly, a survivor who had communicated her own attempted murder from a near-vegetative state, leaving the medical community in this corner of the United States dumbfounded. Reversome 2. During her physical therapy, as she learned to grip a cup again, the forensic report arrived. Ramirez reviewed it with her. The paralytic agent was indeed tetrodotoxin, but its administration was even more insidious than they thought. The initial high dose, disguised in the sherry, was powerful enough to induce the paralysis, but the subsequent maintenance doses were mixed with Serafina's own customized sleeping medication, a benzodiazepine cocktail. Ramirez explained, "Serafina was using your own dependence on her, your deep-seated fatal naivete, to ensure your silence. She knew you'd never suspect a compound mixed with her personal medication, something she shared with you often for comfort." The depth of the betrayal was staggering. It wasn't just the greed, it was the calculated destruction of Alara's trust in the most intimate way possible. The quiet realization settled over her. Her trust had been weaponized against her, a far colder revelation than the poison itself. 6 months later, the main courthouse was quiet on the day Serafina Blackwood was sentenced. Alara sat in the front row, upright, independent, the legal victory complete. Serafina was sentenced to life imprisonment. Alara had survived the impossible, exposed the betrayal, and secured the family fortune. The victory was undeniable, but the cost was profound. The doctors confirmed that while the paralysis had receded, the sustained nerve damage from the tetrodotoxin left Alara with permanent residual symptoms: a constant low-grade tremor in her left hand that made fine motor skills difficult, and chronic low-volume tinnitus, a permanent ringing in her ears, a constant sound like the distant, high-pitched hum of the hospital monitors. This was her physical scar. The deeper wound, however, was the psychological one. Alara had fought desperately to live, to expose the truth, but in doing so, she had been forced to dismantle the most foundational relationship of her life. She looked across the courtroom as Serafina was led away. Serafina mouthed a single word: "Sorry." Alara felt nothing. Her fatal naivete was dead, replaced by a cold, protective shell of absolute certainty. The warmth of familial love was gone, a permanent, irreplaceable loss. She walked out into the crisp New England air, smelling the pine trees and the sea spray, a free woman, wealthy, alive, but utterly, permanently alone. She had won the battle against death, but lost the war against cynicism. She recognized then that the true miracle wasn't the survival of her body, but the survival of her mind, forever marked by the ultimate failure of trust.